So let's turn now to our last speaker, Dr. Suzanne Keen, whose work is foundational for many or most of us. Her work on narratology and empathy is super important. Dr. Keen has taught and been president of Scripps in California, and she will be at Scripps again in the Department of English. And her talk is entitled Narrative Empathy as Animator of the Inanimate. Suzanne?
Thank you so much, Hannah. Appreciate it. In this paper, I explore readers' co-creative and empathy experiencing role in relation to multiple potential targets involved in narrative communication, not only characters. And let me pause and just say, are you all hearing me? Can I get a yes, you can hear me?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, great, excellent. Hannah Wojciehowski and Vittorio Gallese's embodied narratology points the way to an improved understanding of fiction readers' experience of narrative art as mediated intersubjectivity, where the text, the medium, enables readers to entertain multiple relationships with fictional characters and through them with their author. And I'm adding here, and also with narrators, narratees, and implied readers, and I take this to be quite compatible with the points that David was just making in the earlier paper. I'm drawing attention to the impact of multiple roles in the narrative communication model on narrative immersion and empathy. Each in its own way may call upon a reader's empathy through roles that possess their own inherent intercorporeal cues. But which version of empathy, which means so many different things? Einfühlung is a core component of aesthetic empathy for readers feeling into intra and extra-textual roles engaged by fictional narrativity. Often, multiple calls upon a reader's intercorporeal engagement occur at once, and particularly intense experiences of narrative empathy may be attributed to the simultaneous or rapidly interchanging invitations of an immersive fictional world, its compelling existence, the entrancing voice of the narrator, the impulsions of narrativity, its stylistic foregrounding of wrought language, and the reader's self-recognition in or rapport with the implied author or implied reader. Empathy for characters is indisputably the central version of readers' empathy. The perceived similarity of empathy for real and imagined people influences how literary narrative empathy is apprehended and described. Yet characters, or in E.M. Forster's pungent phrase, word masses, are inanimate. Representatives of the species Homo fictus cannot speak for themselves, make decisions about their actions, think, feel, or do any of the things that humans do every day with their bodies. Catherine Gallagher aptly labels characters nobodies. They are assembled out of words, and those words can never document everything about them. A fundamental practice in the experience of reading fictional characters depends on readers filling gaps in characters' limited textual construction to perceive them as possessing body parts, including hearts and minds, experiences, motives, and qualities that they demonstrably lack. Readers bring embodied knowledge to this work, which is both necessary for and constitutive of comprehension. As Elaine Young remarks, quote, mundane physical experiences that readers regularly undergo without a second thought become a means by which they can come to know in deep and durable ways a vibrant, expansive world that has no existence, end quote. Readers' Einfühlung and what Ellen Esrock names transsomatization jumpstart this generous and generative process prompted by bare minimums of characterization and plot, a name, a situation, an emergent obstacle, and perhaps a rudimentary trait. Having given them so much, no wonder that unreal and disembodied characters evoke shared feelings in readers. Many channels exist for readers' empathy to animate the inanimate in fiction reading. This concerns words and narrative forms as they are transmuted by the co-creating reader into scenes, imagery, moods, actions, and persons that evoke aesthetic emotions, including empathy. So narrative empathy, an aesthetic phenomenon that hitches a ride on the neurobiological substrate for intersubjectivity, differs from aesthetic empathy for readers, differs from interpersonal empathy in its stimulant sources, represented targets, and outcomes. Narrative empathy is one of a number of kinds of empathy that real people experience, a version of fantasy empathy that commonly blends role-taking or perspective-taking and emotion sharing with a foundational Einfühlung or feeling into, and strongly associated in the psychological literature with immersion. Experiencing narrative empathy can inform the way people understand analogous emotions in their lives beyond fiction reading, but the prompts for such lessons of aesthetic emotion should not be understood as bound by a set representational or formal requirement. Readers feel intensities of emotion represented and evoked by fictional texts, reacting to vivid worlds, to engrossing stories, to distinctive narrative voices, to the comforts of familiarity and the thrill of strangeness, to the push and pull of plots, and of course, to the circumstances, experiences, and fates of the active agents of stories. Characters, or the person-like existence of fiction, provide a prime example of inanimate constructions that appear lifelike to readers, in an instance of Einfühlung that obscures the textuality of its target. A phenomenon of minds understood as embodied and active, embedded, and expanded, Einfühlung's bringing of fictional characters to life is not radically different from how we think about absent real people or people we remember, but fictional characters are crafted out of stable representations stored in texts. Very little is needed to set animating Einfühlung in motion: a name, a task, or a role to play, an implication of agency. That many narratives provide more richly for the perception of fictional characters, spelling out lineages, education, social worlds, elaborate outfits of clothing and possessions, backstories fretted with traumas or triumphs, and detailed accounts of their interiority, does not in itself demonstrate the necessity of those accessories for character identification or narrative empathy. Developing either rooting interests in or concerns on behalf of characters, as well as the capacity to imagine their perspectives through active mentalizing, depends upon the gift of person-like status that the willing reader supplies to the word mass. Ruminating on the meanings, lessons, and dynamic enigmas generated by narrative discourse may contribute to socio-moral development, though the evidence for the impact of didacticism on readers is mixed at best. But it is very clear that immersed readers come away from their experiences of fiction with strong impressions of and investment in characters and their fates. Even when those characters are sufferers, troublemakers, and non-triumphant protagonists, readers express pleasure in traveling alongside them in a way that differs markedly from the routine encounters or avoidances of real life. The parasocial relationships of fiction reading open up possibilities of both perspective taking and emotion sharing that would be unlikely to occur in many readers' real lives, scaffolded upon readers' more mundane experiences. This sensation of warm belonging, paradoxically equally available to the isolate or one hiding behind a book hoping to block out a real crowd, is surely at the center of the aesthetic pleasure we take in fiction. It's not wrong to name reading escapism. Yet as a consequence of that excursion, the transported reader also benefits from enlarged perspectives and sometimes altered attitudes. We may not be reading characters to remake our own characters, but the co-creation that leads to intercorporeal insights calls inanimate words into service to conjure illusions of person-like beings. There's a lot happening all at once in our conscious minds before we even begin reading. Fiction reading appeals in part because it invites our attention to focus on something like a guided daydream with an appealing shape, beginning, middle, end, a limited duration or finite segments that promise more later, and a refreshing alternative to the press of reality. It also invites readers to engage cognitive and affective capacities for both pleasure and edification. Readers' contemplation, sensory perception, and co-creation contribute to narrative empathy in the absence of another real body or a brain in an embodied yet non-imitative form. Even the most persuasive round character of fiction can possess only a simulacrum of a mental state and cannot respond to a reader's convictions about how together they feel. The devices of narrative fiction conspire to invite readers' belief anyway. It's no wonder that an experience dependent on readers' contributions includes the sensations of the reader's body, which in a self-fulfilling loop of validation help to create the very illusion that readers find persuasive and worthy, in some cases, of their empathy. Though characters are often, not always, described as possessing at least some physical traits, it is no weirder to empathize with a narrator or a narratee with their omnipresent voices and implicit ears and eyes, respectively, than with a represented subject of the narration. For if we accept, as I think we must, that the observation that the majority of the roles called up by narrative communication are played by inanimate non-persons, then we should ask how the real people involved, creators and audience members, activate the other persons of the text and its penumbra, and in the central paradox of narrative empathy, feel with spectral presences made out of words registering in the reader's mind over time. Let me clarify what I mean both by fiction reading and also by narrative empathy, a phenomenon of embodied reading practices. Here's my definition of narrative empathy, which involves both textual features made of language and the various roles of narrative communication that evoke the sharing of feeling and perspective taking induced by reading, viewing, hearing, or imagining narratives of another's situation and condition. Narrative empathy plays a role in the aesthetics of production when authors experience it, in mental simulation during reading, in the aesthetics of reception when readers experience it, and in the narrative poetics of texts when formal strategies invite it. Narrative empathy involves actants, narrative situation, matters of pace and duration, and story world features such as settings, and should not simply be equated with character identification, nor exclusively verified by readers' reports of identification. Narrative fiction offers, by virtue of its narrativity, inviting relational configurations for potential affective resonance, a form of aesthetic response involved in narrative empathy. This can be a layered, complex, lasting response brought about by interpenetrating and mutually reinforcing stimuli, or a fast, fleeting, evanescent feeling with the narrative gone as soon as the next plot twist or arresting image attracts the attention. To put the matter in old-fashioned plain terms, narrative empathy can arise from both content and form, from both story and discourse. My emphasis on the diversity of vantage points for discerning narrative empathy at work comes out of an awareness that the aesthetic experience of fiction, whether as a maker, a receiver, a fan, or a critic, involves us in a complex web of relationships with real human others and utterly unreal beings, to which we bring our cognitive and emotional faculties, including a capacity for empathy rooted in embodied cognition. From the very start, in a theory of narrative empathy, I have contended that narrative empathy for fiction and its imaginary inhabitants hitches a ride on the neurobiological substrate that Vittorio Gallese and his collaborators described as constituting a shared manifold for intersubjectivity and setting off embodied simulations. More recently, Hannah Wojciehowski and Vittorio Gallese have offered a refinement, arguing that intersubjectivity should be viewed first and foremost as intercorporeity, embedded in a proposal for neuroscience-informed affective embodied narratology based in what they call feeling of body as a complement to the more strictly cognitive models advancing contributions to theory of mind. Wojciehowski and Gallese describe a functional mechanism they name liberated embodied simulation that enables readers through FOB to register in our bodies empathic co-feeling with represented others. Real readers all have bodies. I therefore agree with Wojciehowski and Gallese that empathy may be conceived as the outcome of our natural tendency to experience interpersonal relations first and foremost at the implicit level of intercorporeity, a response that includes our relations with fictional characters, though they are made out of words. In a liberated imaginative practice, readers freely fill the experience of fiction with an animating largesse that springs from the inexhaustible wells of their own inner subjectivity. But how does this empathic process work? It operates, I think, through Einfühlung, poured into apprehended literary work using different senses, perceptions, and sensations, shaped by both representational materials and foregrounded narrative communication roles. Examples of such narrative empathy are not limited to cognitive perspective taking. They include feeling with the character's depicted sensations, pain, dread, anticipation, joy, resonating with a group of imaginary beings, situation in a setting, orientation in space, awareness of comings and goings, hearing the distinctive voice of the narrator, recognizing one's own attitudes or judgments in a narratee summoned into being by the narration, matching up neatly to the implied readership or wishing to be worthy of it, and thrilling to the rhythms of the discourse. Readers make a gift not only of their emotional reactions, but of their inward vision, their orientation in fictive spaces, their physical outer surfaces and inner passages, their sub-vocalizations, their breath, their memories of sounds, smells, tastes, and movements, and of bodies that hunger, desire, flinch, and flee. A neat match between these bodily contributions to comprehension and representational content is not required. The feelings and expressions could match up, but they don't have to be identical, rather appropriately similar. This is where Ellen Esrock's transsomatization comes in. And here's Esrock. A transsomatization occurs when viewers reinterpret a component or process of their own bodies to serve as a non-imitative stand-in or correlate for something outside of the self, specifically some quality of an artwork or its production. Transsomatization explains how empathic feeling flows from a sensing viewer or reader to an inanimate target while bearing the hallmarks of embodied simulation, initiating an overlap between selves that can be characteristic of empathy. Esrock's ideas about transsomatization support a nuanced approach to the complex interaction between readers and fictive texts when adapting cognitive and neuroscientific models from research programs that originate in the intersubjectivity of living beings. For all the similarities of narrative empathy to real-life interpersonal empathy, one cannot wish away the fundamental difference that the target of readers' empathic response to fiction is inanimate, inert text that can neither affirm nor deny the validity of readers' aesthetic feelings, no matter how persuasive, memorable, or intense they may be. These imaginings are necessarily located in living persons perceiving texts. Despite the lack of a conscious dyadic partner with whom to build a relationship of live intersubjectivity, the situation of fiction reading invites a co-creating reader to the textually mediated tasks of world-making and character identification and the resulting aesthetic pleasures of absorption and narrative empathy. The imaginative perception rooted in the Einfühlung that supplies narrative empathy with its initiating sensations flows along many channels, not only to character. As artworks and human practices, stories provide a rich matrix for narrative empathy. Fiction reading offers not just information about imagined social worlds and the selves that navigate them, but sociality that arises from the roles of narrative communication. Engaging with these roles is both a natural and little perceived aspect of reading fictional narrative, a co-creative engagement that is entangled with readers' Einfühlung. Authors, real and implied, narrators, narratees, implied readers, and sometimes other actual readers may shimmer into position for a reader's activating attention to light upon, even as the reader enlivens the author's representations of world and characters. Like characters, narrators, and narratees exist in the discourse of texts, whereas implied authors and implied readers are projections of the text who come to life as epiphenomena of the co-creative reading experience. The parasociality of fiction reading includes extratextual persons as well as the existence inside the story and discourse. Authors are or were living beings. They wrote the words. Paradoxically, those most human of all those responsible for initiating fictional communication elicit the unruliest emotional responses, including disappointment, censure, or impatience. Actual authors who in their lifetimes attain celebrity status can earn our empathy, but with fame also comes the risk of cancellation and feelings closer to schadenfreude than empathy. When readers report empathizing with authors, they are nearly always responding not to the actual author, but to their idealized image of the author of a particular text or set of texts for whom they have developed an affinity. Implied authors are projections of the text, perceived and characterized by readers who may or may not find themselves in alignment with the kind of reader that the text also projects. Whether they are ably living up to the competencies of the authorial audience and willingly participating in the generic expectations of the narrative audience, readers are in some sense aware of their fitness and willingness to serve in the roles. Not only can readers feel the author's consciousness of their own abilities and shortcomings, their cooperativeness or balking, but they can also perceive the apparitional versions of implied readers that are called up by the text. Consciousness of not fitting the description of a capable authorial audience member or balking at the text's expectations makes an actual reader hyper-aware of a narrative's projected audiences. But when there's a neat fit and the gaps between authorial and narrative audiences and the actual reader narrow, a reader may experience narrative empathy with the implied reader in its several forms. Living up to the expectations of an author and text in order to become the reader that they require is a robust instantiation of perspective taking. When readers begin a novel or story, they entertain its propositions set against the distractions all around and enter into relations with these roles before compelling experiences of narrative empathy can take hold. As all writers know, nothing guarantees that a reader will keep on reading, nor that the reader will respond with empathy. But let's say the narrative gets a hold of a reader's attention. Where does it reside, the hot coal that ignites the thread of fictive discourse and turns words from inanimate marks on a page or screen into a vanishing fuse? How does the sparking end of that fuse, the phrase or passage that captures the reader's consuming attention, transform into actions, places, agents projected in the mind's eye as if on a lit screen with moving images? Whose breath, is it the author, the reader, the voice of the narration, inflates fictional characters from the scraps of discourse that describe and enact them into plausible persons with recognizable motives and emotions with whom readers can connect? What are the limits of the glow cast by fiction reading when readers carry moods and impressions, characters and their situations away from the text itself into their daydreams and discussions? Are we still reading when we are remembering, speculating about what's next, rereading for the flavor of a world and its denizens when we already know how the story goes, reconstructing our pleasure in a story by discussing it with others? Yes, these activities of giving attention to fiction are all part of the reading experience, even though they can occur in the absence of the text. When we share the aesthetic pleasure of a fictional narrative with others, we aren't just scuffing the ashes, we make the fire burn brightly again by remembering and remaking stories together. What happens when, guided by the thread of discourse, readers enter the labyrinth? The core affects of narrativity, suspense, curiosity, surprise, what Mayer Sternberg has theorized as the three master effects of narrative, command a reader's attention with potential alterations in breathing, heart rate, palm sweat, and other bodily tokens of engagement and response. Though the sensations that betoken suspense, increased heart rate, tension in the back and shoulders, holding one's breath, and surprise, gasping, jumping, blinking, are the easiest to identify, even curiosity registers in the body, manifesting as an alert desire to know that pushes against sleepiness or even a full bladder. Activated by the motive tension between the teller's language, the discourse, and the emerging elements of the story, narrative proffers enigmas. Who's that? What's next? How do we know? Hooked onto person-like beings embedded in a scaffolding for a projected world. The routine enigmas of narrative stimulate curiosity, invite speculation as the what-ifs multiply, demand practice in consideration and elimination of possibilities, set up surprises, and string us along with suspense. Both epistemological and ontological, the enigmas of narrative make excellent vehicles for carrying cultural knowledge and its reassurances of belonging, and for investigating the new, the unexpected, the threat to stability. The narrative art of fiction captures the latent potential of knowledge, twists it into stories, and places it in stasis, where reactivated by reading or retelling, it springs to life, a banked fire blown upon and fed with attention. I can do this work alone because I am a co-creating reader, but when I do it, I am not lonely. The reader joins a band of others, not just other readers, but the persons behind the voice of the story, narrator, implied author, real author, and fictional characters, the depicted beings whose circumstances, desires, actions, and fates can seem more real than people. Each of these phases of imaginative engagement with fiction is driven by readers' embodied simulations. Each can possess its own non-imitative feeling state and amodal attunement that may be experienced as pure loss of self-awareness or as mingling with the work. The reader enters into an alternative story world that possesses its own traits and attendant moods, where ontological questions can stimulate and support the affects of narrativity during immersed reading. Plot actions are not the only qualities of narrative to intrigue, surprise, or to induce suspense. The phenomenon of reading in order to get out of this world into an imaginary one is well attested, and much of readers' feelings for and about writers derives from authors' association with and contested control of the fictional worlds they create and elaborate. Einfühlung contributes significantly to readers' recognition of fictional spaces and places. Writers making impossible secondary worlds count on this capacity of readers to orient themselves and move mentally while staying perfectly still. Indeed, some readers are there mainly for the world making, as others come for the specifically linguistic pleasures of style. Setting can be the source of aesthetic emotions in their own right. The emotions readers experience while reading fiction encompass both fiction emotions, the responses to immersion in a represented world and its existence, and also artifact emotions or responses to the shaping and directing of the artwork. Writers devise multiple avenues for readers to enter into imaginative and affective relations with fictional worlds, parsing the relationships, social and rhetorical, that mediate the imaginative transactions of narrative communication from authors, narrators, and characters, narratees, readers, illuminates additional pathways for activated narrative empathy. Empathy for characters can be complex and layered, responding simultaneously to the depiction of a person-like existence, thoughts, and feelings, that character's role as an actant, sending, helping, opposing, or receiving the narrative's object, and in intersection with plot developments or stylistic techniques, the aesthetic emotions that arise from narrative art. Literary narratives may foreground for empathy the voice, role, or invited reaction of a narratee, or the reliability or unreliability, attitudinal consonance or dissonance of a narrator, just as readily as they offer armatures for affective resonance in the form of character. The complexity of these overlapping and potentially contradictory stimuli obviates a conception of narrative empathy that goes well beyond a one-to-one match in shared feelings or character identification. Thank you so much for your attention at the end of this very rich and stimulating day.